welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Loftus. I'm really pleased to have with us on the show today Dr. Flemming Hansen, Senior Researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. Flemming, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Flemming has recently written some very interesting pieces about Russia's use of information operations, and I thought we could use this session to talk about that in detail. So lately we've heard a lot about how warfare has changed and how there are modern forms of warfare. The term hybrid war is very often in use. So what would you consider to be more modern types of warfare as opposed to more traditional forms of warfare? And why do you suppose that warfare has evolved in this way today?
Well, we see a lot of changes, of course, to the way that war is being conducted. We also see return to something more old-fashioned. Now we've just witnessed the renewal of fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh, and even as we speak today, as this is being recorded, we received news about a peace agreement. But during those past weeks, of course, we've seen mercenaries, for instance, which is a return to something much more well-known, old-fashioned, you may say, medieval. So we're seeing developments which are pointing in different directions. The work that I do and the work that you refer to looks at the way in which information is being used. And that is, of course, not a new aspect of war. It's a new aspect in the sense that developments of modern information and communications technologies have opened like a broad avenue for different ways of influencing audiences and perhaps even to avoid war as a final step. So in that sense, it's well known, but it's also new, and it offers some sort of promising potential for states in particular.
Yes, we've heard a lot about, let's say, disinformation, but we've also heard about misinformation and fake news, and there's just a lot of different terms floating around. Would you tell us a little bit what the difference is between these?
Yeah, it is a bit confusing in particular, of course, because fake news now it's a catch-all, and whenever I speak to people about this, I also resign to the fact that fake news is the new term to use because it's just so convenient and people understand it immediately. The way that I usually define this is that disinformation, so with the D, is intentionally wrong information. It's a lie, and whoever sends it knows that it is a lie. Misinformation with an M instead is information sent by someone who doesn't realize that it is a lie. So you can have a piece of disinformation which is sent to, let's say, a wider audience, and members of this audience will then pass it on, perhaps without knowing that it's a lie. So disinformation may turn into misinformation. Fake news, as I read the term, combines both. It has some disinformation, has some misinformation, and I would probably say that the way that it's being used mostly now is as a shorthand for disinformation, so intentionally wrong information.
I see. And yes, of course, with the advent of social media, it's so much easier to spread this exponentially fast. I heard that the more sensationalist a piece of news is, the faster it gets spread all over. So
Yeah,
it's quite dangerous.
that's true. That's true. Research shows that the more sensational it is, the faster it is being spread. But we also know that lies simply travel faster than truth, often because they are more spectacular, because they are more newsworthy, because they generate more interest. So there is sort of a dynamic to this, which is very important to understand, which may be exploited by some.
Absolutely. And we've seen that with a lot of disinformation campaigns going on, especially now during this coronavirus pandemic.
Yes.
Certainly, there's been quite a few different actors using this to their advantage. According to your paper that I read recently, for the sender, the optimal cognitive effect is an unconscious and complex learning in the receiver.
Yeah.
What does this mean exactly? What is the mechanism behind disinformation and this logistical goal that you're referring to here?
Well, I'm referring to a cognitive effect, which essentially is a learning process, which means that the one who receives the information should learn from it. Either what we often refer to as simple learning, which is simply an external stimuli. You decide to do certain things because, well, you may be rewarded for doing it, or you do certain things because you're afraid of not doing it. You may be afraid perhaps of being punished or whatever. And that's a simple learning process. So you simply draw the conclusion that it's better for you to act in a particular way because, well, you may get benefits or you may risk punishment. Complex learning, on the other hand, is when deeper processes take place. This is when, for instance, fundamental norms may change, when fundamental worldviews may change, the way that receivers will see the world, the way that they will assess particular issues, for instance, relating to world politics. And the sender wants to achieve a complex learning process. The sender wants to ideally to change fundamental norms or worldviews within the receiver. And the best way to do this is to do this in a way in which the receiver doesn't notice that he or she is being influenced. So you may have a simple learning process where we realize that we are being influenced. We understand that the calculus that we are doing, the pros and cons of a particular position will change, are being changed for us. Whereas when it's unconscious, it's a complex learning process, but it's unconscious. So we change our worldviews, but we don't realize that we are being influenced by others. And this is ideal for the sender because it promises to have a longer lasting effect. And it also promises to have an effect where the receiver, as I said, doesn't realize that he or she is being influenced. So we have this sense that we have reached this conclusion ourselves, that no one has tried to point us to a particular conclusion, but this is through our own sort of mental processes that we have reached the conclusion that this is how it is and this is how I'm going to respond.
That sounds quite scary, and that our minds are all being controlled by some supreme force somewhere. I've heard a lot of debate going on. I would say the Russian narrative and the Western narrative, they're all just convinced that the other side is waging disinformation campaigns. So if I speak to Russians about how the Russians intervened in the US election, they'll start laughing and they'll say, well, hasn't the US done this many times to us as well, or to the rest of the world, in this type of narrative? Or if I speak to an American or a European, or what's going on, like, for example, telling them, say that the Russian narrative is that the West tends to interfere. They say, oh, that's what the Russians want you to believe. That's part of the narrative, and you're falling for it. So it's a bit confusing. So both Russia and the US think the other is waging information war on the other. And so in your opinion, are they both doing so? And what strategies are they using respectively?
Well, clearly something is happening on both sides. And clearly, for instance, during the Cold War, something was happening on both sides. But there is still, I have to insist, a fundamental difference. So if you look at the media landscape in Russia today, for instance, it is to a large extent, of course, state control. And by state control, I mean media outlets that are owned by the state. They're owned by companies that are owned by the state, or they may be owned by individuals, but individuals who want to be really close to the Kremlin. And so they follow the official narratives. And then surrounding this sort of bubble of state-controlled media, you have the free media. And of course, in Russia today, there are free media, newspapers, radio stations, television stations. But you don't have the same kind of public debate, and you just don't have the media scrutiny that you would find often in liberal democratic countries. So witness, for instance, Russian involvement in Ukraine, Russian involvement in Syria, or witness, for instance, as I just did, I looked at the way that the Navalny and Skripal cases have been covered in Russia, and this, of course, is Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, who was poisoned with Novichok in August this year, and then Skripal, the former Russian Soviet agent, who was poisoned with Novichok in March 2018. And you don't really find those critical voices within the Russian media landscape who will ask the obvious question: did our state just attempt to kill two of our citizens? So there is a fundamental difference, of course, and this also means that the way that they operate on those two sides also see huge differences. But of course, attempts are being made from Western side, US side, for instance, to influence the Russian audience, for instance, to bring it closer to an understanding of liberal democratic values. Could be other targets as well. But this is part of it, and Russia has its narrative, or has a catalog of narratives that it tries to send to different Western audiences. So something is happening on both sides, definitely, but there are still fundamental differences between the two sides.
I see. And there are also different domains, right, in which information operations take place. You've written about that. Would you clarify that for us as well?
Sure. So what I've suggested is that we look at this as of consisting of three different domains. So we have a physical domain, we have a digital domain, or cyber domain. I like to use the term digital domain because often when I write about this, when I speak about this, it is reference to our digital infrastructure. So it's about the protection of critical digital infrastructure. And then we have the cognitive domain. So a physical domain, a digital domain, and the cognitive domain. The cognitive domain, of course, is, I mean, I should say, this is where the thinking takes place. So when we speak about how to influence others, and we speak about this effect and learning processes, this happens within the cognitive domain. The cognitive domain is not an operational domain. You can't just sort of walk around. You can't initiate operations within the cognitive domain, but you can initiate operations within the digital domain and within the physical domain that are designed to influence within the cognitive domain. And much of the Russian thinking and literature that I have tried to go over in some of these recent studies is very advanced. It's very interesting, and it tries to combine the different domains and to think about how to achieve the greatest possible effect within these domains, in particular, of course, when it comes to, for instance, manipulation and information to influence others, how to combine the digital domain, where we find, for instance, social media, and to combine that with the cognitive domain. So how to influence voters' preferences, for instance.
I see. Well, it's very intricate and complex, and a lot goes into this. These operations, especially let's say in times of conflict, or to explain what's going on in an open conflict, you'll have both sides or multiple external actors also explaining the conflict from their perspective, and often none seem to have the same narrative about what's going on in that particular area. General Gerasimov, known for the Gerasimov doctrine, stated that in any type of conflict, there's also an information battle. So if we're talking about conflicts where Russia was involved, there was the 2008 conflict with Georgia and then the annexation of Crimea. And both have seemed to be quite different from the other, especially in terms of the information battle that took place or is taking place currently with Crimea. Would you tell us the difference between these two conflicts, and why, let's say, the most recent one in Crimea seems to be a bit more advanced in the operations domain?
Sure. I mean, I can do this with reference to some of the Russian literature, and there's a general understanding that Russia in 2008, during the war in Georgia, so this, of course, is South Ossetia and Abkhazia, was not ready for this type of information operation, for operations that are targeting the cognitive domain. Margarita Simonian, editor-in-chief of RT, for instance, explained that in 2008 we were not ready. But between 2008 and 2014, we got ready, and we were ready to fight alongside the Ministry of Defense. She explains when war then broke out, or when Crimea was invaded and then annexed in February, March 2014. So a lot of learning has happened in Russia, and it continues to develop. But learning happened in those crucial years, and there was a general understanding, and Valery Gerasimov has also explained this in some of his articles, that information now is a vital tool, that you may use different types of platforms, in particular social media platforms, to influence voters. And he points to the West, of course, the US in particular, and says, look, they have taken this on board. They have developed tools with which to influence people, including in Russia, and we need to deal with this. And so since then, since this realization, a lot of thinking has occurred in Russia. I still see in the Russian literature and in the Russian debate sort of a cries sometimes that Russia is not doing well enough in the information sphere, that Russia is not ready to combat the West when it comes to information operation. Russia needs to be more aggressive and to probably to think in a more sort of holistic way about these issues. So there is this this part of the Russian debate, which is that we have learned, but we haven't learned enough, and we need to be much more proficient at this, and to develop our thinking still, and the infrastructure that we have in order to deal with this in a better way.
And it's also really tricky because you can twist facts in all types of ways and construct arguments that are really quite convincing on both sides. So it's hard to find, the truth, as some would say, that there is no truth anymore.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. It has become even more complicated, and of course now we see deep fakes, or digitally manipulated videos, for instance, which could potentially be a huge problem, and we've seen some of the consequences of that already. And so it is becoming still more difficult, and various actors are learning from this. So the way that I've described this sometimes also is that it's a kind of learning race between various actors. So you will have states, for instance, that try to influence voters in other states, and you will have public authorities that try to deal with this, and they need to handle this in different ways, and both are learning at the same time. Most public authorities will find that it's difficult to keep up with those who are on the offensive. They may be half a step behind, and that's just how it is. We don't need to panic because of that. We find the same, for instance, when it comes to international terrorism. We're often half a step behind. It's also a learning race. Some people are trying to exploit the various gaps that may still exist, and we try to close the gaps. And we find the same in the information space, and as it concerns information battle. But it is a learning race, and we see that various actors are getting still better at this, and different public authorities are also trying to learn, and they try to close the gaps and to prevent disinformation or misinformation or fake news to enter the information space, or at least to do damage within the information space.
And it's gotten so much more complex and intricate as a result of technological innovations and social media, and it's much more hard. It's harder to respond to than it was during the Cold War, for example. And a prime example of that is what happened during the 2016 elections in the United States. The Internet Research Agency, the IRA, was accused of conducting a sustained effort to manipulate the US public and undermine democracy in the United States. They were caught with bots and fake social media accounts influencing people on Facebook and Twitter. Could you tell us a little bit about what they did first, and if you think that they really actually did undermine US democracy?
Well, what they did, I guess, simply put, is that they realized that here is a potential to be exploited. It's something that we need to look at, and we'll see what we can achieve. Um, it holds great potential. It comes at a relatively low cost, and as we've seen so far, also at a relatively low cost in terms of sanctions, so the possible negative repercussions from this. But there is an opportunity to exploit this domain, to exploit the sort of the nexus between the digital domain and the cognitive domain in ways that we haven't seen before. And of course, this is in many ways the future, and we will see much more of this. And we've seen the Russian side try to exploit this, to manipulate, testing out various strategies. Uh, some quite rudimentary, some much more advanced, in a way to influence US voters in particular. And sometimes we see it also in combination with a different aspect of the digital domain, which is to go into computer networks and steal information, and to use that information as part of information operations. So there's a different nexus between the digital domain and the cognitive domain. In terms of effect, I think it's really difficult to say. I remain skeptical as to the effect of the Russian operations. I'm sure, I mean, it's been well documented that they did try to influence US voters, and even to a large extent, and they had a rather impressive reach. But reach is not the same as influence and the same as cognitive effect. So you may see a certain piece of information, but it's not necessarily so that you are influenced by it. And even if people are influenced by it, I also find it difficult to measure the effect. Now, we spoke earlier about this learning process, this complex learning process, whereby people are being convinced of particular norms or worldviews, for instance, but they don't realize that they are being influenced by some external agent. And in those cases, it's really difficult to measure, I believe. So I remain skeptical. I'm sure that Russia has attempted to do so, 2020 also. And we need to develop better tools with which to measure the possible effect, keeping in mind that it is really difficult, especially if it's done in a really skillful way. Then it would be difficult for us, I'm sure, to measure the cognitive effect, the final effect that the sender is hoping to achieve. But it is an area, of course, that holds, as I said, great potential. We'll see much more of this.
But oftentimes these operations work to basically reinforce your pre-existing beliefs. So on social media, for example, it's kind of the way the YouTube algorithm works, is that you see a video that you looked for and searched, and then other videos that are similar will pop up, because they'll think that you're interested in watching those types of videos. So it maybe disinformation and these types of campaigns are best at enhancing what you already sort of are inclined to think, which means that maybe it did not have the effect that we thought of, kind of changing a lot of people's minds. It probably was more effective on voters who didn't know who to vote for, or who were already predisposed to vote for one candidate over the other.
Absolutely, that's a good point. And so it may have served to sort of cement existing political opinions and various views. And that would reflect also the way that we use more traditional media. Now you mentioned YouTube algorithm that sort of keeps feeding stuff that it supposes that we like. But most of us, of course, look for information. We look for news, for instance, that will reflect the political views that we have already. Few people are so curious that they go searching for views that are in stark contrast to what they believe already. Studies, of course, show that most people look for the news that will convince them, confirm that they are right, that the way that they see the world is right. And most people who still have newspaper subscriptions, of course, will subscribe to a newspaper that reflects the worldviews that they have, the political views that they have. So in that sense, yes, it may be that it has served mainly to cement already existing political views. With more advances in technology, for instance, still more advanced use of artificial intelligence in order to collect data and to process data, we may have more detailed portraits of individuals even. So these personas may emerge more clearly. And with that, it could probably be easier to identify those who do not hold really strong political views, and we may identify more easily whom we potentially could persuade to vote in a particular way, if only we sort of we manipulate them in the right way, if only we find the right issues with which to sort of influence them and to impress them. So there's also an additional aspect. It's new technology being brought onto already quite advanced technology.
And there's a very fine line here because it's not exactly illegal, you know. We're just trying to influence people to think in a certain way, and there's not a lot of, you know, kind of strict, you know, laws about doing so. You know, it's something that we've done forever.
Absolutely, and most of the research that we see, of course, has been developed for the corporate industry. It's for to bring us to buy certain things, and I'm sure many of the viewers will recognize the experience of going into a supermarket. You only need a few items, and then you emerge from the supermarket and you ended up buying much more than you expected, and it's because they influence us in a particular way. Of course, now supermarkets also started to use artificial intelligence to rotate the goods around the supermarket so that it stands in an optimal place at a particular time. So that is part of the research, and these are psychologists, as I say in the article, who've gone on to the dark side. But that's how it is, of course. Different actors will try to influence us in various ways. But quite interestingly, we saw from the Russian side, this was from Russian President Vladimir Putin, and it also came from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, a suggestion just a month ago or so to regulate this field, to regulate the use of information communication technology, and to sort of have a mutual pledge. Initially, it should be between the US and Russia, and then eventually a broader regime could be developed within framework of the United Nations, but to have a pledge not to use these technologies against other states, so that you sort of take it upon yourself not to use these new technologies in an offensive way, in a way by which you could influence voters in different countries and other countries, because still try to influence, of course, the domestic audience. We should keep in mind that the most important information space for Russian leadership, of course, is within Russia itself. But we see small steps, which are quite interesting, suggesting some kind of regime to be introduced. And my reading of the Russian proposal is that there is a recognition in Russia also that Russia may be susceptible to this, that Russian public is susceptible to this, that a kind of vulnerability may exist within Russia as far as foreign influence is concerned, and a kind of appetite perhaps even for information from abroad, which could change certain political norms and the way that the current regime, for instance, is being seen.
Yes, absolutely. I think an international agreement and a regime of some sort to control this a little bit better is definitely in order. Otherwise, there'll be just chaos everywhere, everyone trying to influence everyone to act and behave the way that is most interesting for them. And you know, last time during the elections in 2016, we heard all about it. Oh, the Russians did this, the Russians did this. So far, we haven't really heard so much about this time around. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, however you tended to lean, there was a different victor. So some will say, oh, is it because the Russians weren't involved this time? Or is it because, you know, Trump kind of led to his own demise? We don't know. But do you think that they still were involved somehow in a type of operations campaign this time?
I'm sure they will, simply because it's too attractive not to be involved. But I would like to wait just a little to see reports from the U.S. authorities on this and what they have discovered. Now, I mentioned earlier that the repercussions following 2016 perhaps were not severe enough. But it could be that they served as a kind of warning perhaps this time, that don't get too far involved in this. Be careful what you do. Don't mess with our electoral system in the way that you did 4 years ago. But we have had reports, of course, coming out in the fall about Russian interference in the election. And it seems obvious that there would be some kind of attempt, simply because it is so tempting and because it is such an easy and cost-efficient way to at least try to achieve certain effects.
Yes, and when we're talking about two different powers, generally they have two different levels of strength. So hybrid tactics or asymmetric tactics are often used on the side of the weaker power to be able to influence the stronger power, since maybe in more traditional ways they wouldn't be able to match up exactly. So how could you explain the way that information warfare gives the weaker power advantage, but then how also can the stronger power use the information tools to strengthen its own position?
Well, as I see it, the weaker power can hope to achieve effects that otherwise would be beyond its reach. So it may try to influence, for instance, political preferences in a target state, hoping to change the views concerning, let's say, sanctions, for instance, or involvement in particular conflicts and so on. And for that, it's a kind of sort of ersatz tool. It's something that otherwise you may not have the financial muscle, for instance, or traditional military kinetic muscle to achieve. And so you try to use information and to see what happens. So it's a way for the weaker power to attempt to try to achieve certain effects. And it's very attractive for reasons that we've discussed already. And I think that I feel absolutely certain that we'll see much more of this also on the side of course, of the weaker actors. The stronger actor may hope to use this also to achieve sort of similar effects. In this case, they're interesting and attractive simply because it's easy reach. It's again cost effective. It's something that can be designed from home. You may sit behind your desk and you collect data and you process data and you design and execute information operations designed to influence voters in other countries. And the stronger party, the stronger actor, may hope to benefit from advances in technology also. And again, I mentioned, for instance, artificial intelligence. So we have a race now between different states in sort of within artificial intelligence, within the development of artificial intelligence. And there's a recognition among some of these states, we see this in Russia, for instance, that whoever leads the leading states within this race may have certain new tools to be employed. They may have certain benefits that the other states will not enjoy, and that may actually widen the gap that exists. So we speak now with reference to artificial intelligence, for instance, for a necessity of some of the other states to think creatively about how to close this possible gap. And some people refer back to the development first of nuclear weapons and then the development of stealth technology as similar sudden gaps that were sort of provoked and that we could witness within the international system. So further advances within sort of the technological realm in particular, now artificial intelligence, may actually benefit the stronger side also. So there's a super interesting race between the weaker side who's trying to think creatively about this. The weaker side may not have access to the same tools, but they try to think creatively about how to use this, and then the stronger side who may also think creatively about this in the hope to bolster its lead and perhaps even to further its lead in the international system.
And it's very useful to try and understand a nation's foreign policy or domestic policy objectives, or its strategic culture, as we've heard this term floating around. So a deeper understanding of the domain-specific strategic culture you mentioned is likely to help in formulating more effective responses within each domain. So in terms of Russia's particular strategic culture in the cognitive domain, what would you say defines that strategic culture? What are their objectives, and how then can the West or other actors, not necessarily only the West, respond to their actions?
Sure. So what I've suggested in one of these articles is to, as I said, we think of three domains: a physical domain, a digital domain, and a cognitive domain. And I suggest to think about an overall strategic culture, but also a strategic culture that is specific to each domain. I would assume, of course, that once you add it all together, once you look at it, look at the specific strategic cultures, you would find that they're quite alike. It would be probably a bit strange for a state to have a very strong strategic culture within one domain and then a much weaker strategic culture within a different domain. But in principle, of course, it could happen. So when you look at the Russian strategic culture, I should say that I think of strategic culture as a kind of sort of a cultural variable, a cultural component that helps define what is possible within these domains, the way that the state thinks about how far to go, what kinds of tools to employ. That Russia has what we usually refer to as a very robust strategic culture. And by robust, of course, we mean that it's aggressive. It's a euphemism for a culture that is quite aggressive. They are willing to go quite far and perhaps even beyond what a number of other states would do. And we find this in all domains. We find it in the physical domain, for instance. Witness, for instance, the way that the invasion, annexation of Crimea took place. Witness Russian involvement in the war in eastern Ukraine. Or witness, for instance, the way that fighting has developed also in Syria, including even the use of banned weapon systems. We find the same in the digital domain, the way that cyber attacks are being launched from Russia, and we find it in the cognitive domain with disinformation campaigns, and of course information operations that are not strictly disinformation. It's not a lie, but they are extremely biased, and they're designed in a sort of very sort of rudimentary way to influence voters in different countries. So quite robust strategic cultures within each domain, and a robust strategic culture, of course, across the whole spectrum. It may help Western states design policies if we have this understanding, realization of how far Russia is willing to go within the different domains.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as you mentioned, strategic culture. What though would Russia's final objective be, though? Are they trying to get others to lean more towards its view of the world, or its view of how the world should be organized in terms of power dynamics? I mean, what are they trying to achieve? A demise of Western democracy so that they can rise, or what's their idea here?
Well, that's a super interesting question. Of course, it's also a very difficult question, and I'm not quite sure how to really nail that, because we may see different interests. Some people, of course, will argue that it's basically about regime survival, that that regime of Vladimir Putin, all the people around him and all the people around those people around him have an interest, of course, in the continued survival of the regime in whatever shape, and that policies are designed to support this. Others will say, no, that's too narrow. There is actually a set of national interest, for instance, state interest, that we may observe, and this is what Russia is looking to achieve. They will point, for instance, to the makeup of the international system, where Russia sometimes is referred to as a revisionist power. Now, revisionist powers have a very poor reputation for obvious reasons, but it's a bit unfortunate, because to be revisionist simply means that you're opposed to the status quo. And when we look at the status quo as it has existed since the end of the Cold War, of course, there are certain elements that Russia is opposed to. The number of elements also that Russia supports. The way that I usually put this is that in general, it supports the overall structure. It supports the building. The building is fine, but it would like to rearrange some of the furniture, and that may be part of it. So smaller issues influence here, influence there, perhaps, but the overall structure and the way that has been set up in I would say largely reflects Russian interest also. Um, it could have more specific interest related, for instance, to the post-Soviet space, which is also your area of research. And we've seen, of course, now interesting developments just this year, since the summer, we've seen developments in Belarus, of course, following the presidential election. We've seen the outbreak of hostilities over Nagorno-Karabakh, so between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And we've also seen unrest in Kyrgyzstan. And this suggests, of course, that this is a volatile space, and something is happening within this post-Soviet space, or the space of what we may loosely refer to as a Commonwealth of Independent States. And this is where Russia has its key interest in it. It's hoping to achieve certain things there, and to protect its interests there. So I can't give you an easy answer to what I believe is a super interesting but also very complex question.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's very hard to answer something like that, especially I don't even know if the Russians themselves know exactly. And so Russia's not the only actor that engages in these operations, of course. And we've seen, especially during the pandemic lately, that there's been some Chinese use of information operations. Do you think the Chinese are learning from the Russians here, or do they have similar goals in their information operations, or what do you think?
I'm sure that they are learning. I'm sure that there is cooperation. I'm sure there is some kind of copying from the Chinese side. The Russian state, we have to say, has been quite good at this development of its sort of information operations tool. I think has been quite impressive. Um, again, we still need to discuss the effect, but the media landscape, the media sort of platforms as they have been developed, I think are very impressive. And China undoubtedly, together with a number of other states, are trying to learn from this. And the Chinese, of course, have more resources. They have better technology, and they may make possibly really fast advances simply because they can stand on the shoulders of others, and they can learn from some of the mistakes that have been made. They can try to copy some of the successes that have also been made. It's maybe more difficult, I suspect, but then again, my main area of research, of course, is the former Soviet space. It may be more difficult for China because of cultural differences, and we've seen even with the Russian communication strategy and the way they have developed the information tool, is that it has been sharpened over years, and they realized that initially they made some mistakes. One of the mistakes is, for instance, to have Russian speakers, but speaking in, let's say, English or German or French or Spanish or whatever, but with an accent. So viewers immediately recognize there's something wrong here. These are not from our country. These are not our journalists. These are not our TV presenters. And they've learned from that. And they try to sort of nativize part of their shows and their news broadcasts. So, of course, mistakes are made. It's always, as I said earlier, it's a learning race, and they continue to learn from this, and they develop that. And the Chinese can piggyback, and they can stand on the shoulders of some of the lessons that have been learned already, and I'm sure they'll try to do so. But the cultural component may be more difficult, perhaps, for them to negotiate, and they may have to think more creatively about how to do so.
Interesting. So the major themes of this podcast are disinformation campaigns, which we've spoke a lot about, but also great power competition and the transatlantic relationship. So I thought I'd ask you your opinion on how disinformation campaigns and information warfare have affected this great power competition and the power balance in the world, as well as how they've affected the transatlantic relationship.
Well, I'm sure that they have affected in some way. I mean, you you know, of course, that we on our side, for instance, in Europe, when we look at the transatlantic relationship, especially between the US and Europe, of course, we focus very much on some of the comments that were made by the now outgoing US President Donald Trump, and the way that certain issues were framed. But I don't think that information and disinformation really drives some of these big changes. It will definitely be used by a lot of actors, and there will be attempts to influence voters in other countries, but something more fundamental is probably at play, and that this could be changes in power, more sort of traditional understanding of power, economic power, for instance, technology, the development of new weapon systems, and it could also be cultural aspects. And one of the things that we see perhaps in relations between the US and Europe, at least Western Europe, say within NATO, would be cultural changes. So a sort of that we're slowly drifting apart. Something has happened over the past few years and perhaps decades that is bringing us further apart, and may necessitate, at least among the European allies, a rethink of how we set up our defense systems and what our contributions could be and should be and may be, and perhaps also a further development of European forces. So I think information operations will definitely play a part in this, and they will be still more present, and they will be still more skilled, and they will be still more sort of penetrate still more. But something larger may be at play, and that these will be more traditional changes in the distribution of power that we're witnessing, and which may only accelerate perhaps in coming years.
Yeah, I think the major issue at play here, both for great power competition and for the transatlantic relationship, is the ability of the disinformation campaigns to divide and sow. So it's the ability to exacerbate pre-existing tensions in different European nations and within the United States tends to create more problems at home. And when there are more problems at home, there's less focus abroad, or there's less, maybe less chance of a consensus between the European Union and the United States. I mean, it sounds a bit vague, but I think that that's really the strength of those campaigns. So they kind of act to reinforce all the structural issues at play that are already going on.
Yes. Well, I think that's a good point. And as you just said earlier, perhaps some of these campaigns may bolster political views that exist already. And so if you see tension within society, if you see a political conflict, of course, it may cement this conflict, may perhaps even drive people further apart, as they are convinced still more of the fact that they are right, of course, and the other side is wrong. So in that sense, information operations can be used to sort of to weaken different societies simply by taking advantage of pre-existing conflicts and divides within this particular state, within this particular society.
Well, we have a lot of work to do, it seems. Flemming, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. That was a very interesting conversation.
Well, thank you for having me, and yeah, very much enjoyed discussing this important topic.
Indeed. And for the audience, thank you so much for tuning back in to Security in the 21st Century.